I was asked the question, well, isn't reason enough? What do we need God for?
Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. My guest today is Scott Shay. Scott co-founded Signature Bank back in 2001. He's a thought leader. He's an author. He's got a real interesting personal stories. He's actually the son of a Holocaust survivor, and Scott gives us that story a little bit. So we had a great conversation. We focused on Scott's latest book titled "In Good Faith: Questioning Religion and Atheism." I really had a great conversation. We talked about the Bible, atheism, free will, why evil exists, and Scott really tied it to his own personal story. So with that, let's jump in. Scott Shay. Scott, thank you so much for your time. I know you're super busy. I guess looking into your background and whatnot, your background is certainly unique. So we really got to open up with you, give them a little bio of your backstory and your dad and the Holocaust. I mean, truly, unique background. If you can just give a background there, I think that'll be great.
So, I grew up the son of a Holocaust survivor. My father was 13 and a half years old or so when the Nazis came, just shy of 14 actually, when the Nazis came to Szwedztyn, Lithuania, and they and his Lithuanian, the Nazis, with the assistance, sadly, of some of his Lithuanian neighbors, murdered my father's father, my father's aunts, uncles, cousins, just about everybody. His mother had already died in childbirth with a brother who was murdered as well. A younger brother was murdered as well. And he was sent to slave labor. He survived slave labor. Then he was sent to Auschwitz. And then from Auschwitz, he was, and I would say this in quotation marks, fortunate enough to be sent off on a work detail to Warsaw. And then he was sent to Dachau, and he was liberated. And this is where he had great fortune, and I'm obviously here because of it, is that he was liberated by the American forces, and by then they knew you couldn't just give people food who were emaciated. My father was less than 70 pounds when he was liberated. He might have only lived days, weeks, not much longer in his condition, but the American Army hospital nursed him back to health, and he came to the United States, and he became a carpenter. And I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment where my parents had the bedroom. I had a day bed in the dining room, and for some years, my mother's brother lived in the living room. He ultimately moved out. So my father had this very interesting relationship with God, and it was, in a way, what encouraged me to write this book in the last analysis, which is my father knew that there was a God. There was literally no uncertainty because so many things had happened that literally had a coffee cup in on the right side as opposed to the left side. Someone started counting people one person over.
Right.
Had a train conductor done a minor different thing when he was thrown on a certain trains that would have led it to his death, done something inextricably minor, he would have been dead. So he knew that there was a whole bunch of miracles that got him from Szwedztyn, Lithuania to Chicago, Illinois. But what he couldn't forgive God for was that his aunts, his uncles, his father, almost everybody he knew from Szwedztyn, with literally one or two exceptions, was murdered. And that was tough. That's a tough It's tough. And so my father was one of those people who went to synagogue, but he basically talked during services, dozed off during the rabbi's sermon, but he always made sure that me, his son, like some of his friends
Right.
similarly situated, they made sure I went to Hebrew school, was bar mitzvahed, he donated to the synagogue, etc. But he couldn't really talk to God. And as I say in the book, I mean, I think God knew that my father was giving him the silent treatment, and I'm perfectly comfortable that God understood why.
Right. Interesting. So he was mad at God as opposed to there is no God, which is a huge difference, right?
Huge difference.
Being mad at God is obviously implying there certainly is one, but I'm not talking to you right now because I'm kind of pissed.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. Now I mean that's so. Yeah, I mean it's a crazy story. It's amazing. But obviously it inspired you. And now this book took 4 or 5 years, 6. I saw a couple of interviews. We were kind of talking about it. It's certainly labor of love, right?
Oh yeah, this was a 5-year effort by me. 5-year. It took me 5 years, and in order to do it, I essentially gave up everything except my work, my family, and I also had wine. But I used to be a cyclist. I used to do a whole bunch of other things in my life. I used to be on a number of more charitable boards and volunteer directors. I had to set it all. I didn't set everything aside, but I certainly became almost on Sunday, Saturday, and it's a recluse. I mean, I stopped going to weddings if I didn't know the people well.
Right.
I just send a gift because I was like so protective of. The only way to write a book like I'm sure this is true for a lot of people, but the only way for me to have written this book was to obsess.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I obsessed, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah. Now, I also had read that the genesis of this book, obviously your background, and you're probably stewing on some things deep in your soul for a long time, but you were searching for answers that you just couldn't find, I think, right? And you decided, what the heck, I'm gonna articulate the answers in this book, and I'm gonna do it myself. Is that?
That's 100%. I mean, so my day job is I'm a banker, but people know I'm a believer, that I believe in God, and more people were asking me questions about Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. Your listeners will recognize all these names.
Right.
Evangelical atheists.
Peter Singer,
Peter Singer is somebody I address in the book as well. Also, by the way, it wasn't in the beginning of my writing of this book, but Yuval Harari, who believes we're basically all just an accident in many ways. Certainly a nihilistic, atheistic writer, if there ever was one.
Right. Just random chaos caused us to be based on a lot of time and a lot of chaotic events just happening, right? Random.
Yeah, and his second book, Homo Deus, after he wrote Sapiens, it underscores that, in that he basically says people are going to become, where our new gods, he says, are going to come from Silicon Valley. And I spent a lot of time talking to people about these issues, and I found there were basically 3 sorts of people. One who don't believe in God, and that's a growing number. They would tell me, God is like Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny. And then people who say they believe in God, but after going to college and after reading modern science, they realize it's irrational, but they still believe. And then there's a third group, and I include myself in this group, that believes that it's rational to believe in a monotheistic God with all we know about science and the historicity of the Bible, and indeed our sense of modern morality. So I went looking for a book or books that would make these points that I could recommend to people who had read The God Delusion, or by Richard Dawkins, or God is Not Great, Why God Poisons Everything by Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Letter to a Christian Nation. I did a serious search, and I read Karen Armstrong's books, and I read a bunch of other books, and I didn't find one that satisfied me, and that you didn't have to sort of start out a bit as a believer, whether Christian or otherwise, Christian, Jewish or otherwise, to latch onto. I mean, I think the best writer out there is for this is Alvin Plantinga. I don't know if he's now a professor emeritus at Notre Dame. He's a great writer. He wrote Where the Conflict Really Lies. It's a great book. He's written other things. I mean, basically, I think he's great, but he writes in a much more technical manner. So I wanted to write in a more accessible manner. Right. And that's what I did. I mean, even though these are some of these are complicated ideas, I didn't do any deep dives into, Thomas Aquinas or, quantum mechanics in a way that people couldn't understand. I did put some of that in an appendix, but I wanted it to be accessible. You can read it. You can give it to your puzzled son or daughter who's a college student, and just open it up and answer questions. That's also why I did the chapters in the way I did.
Right. Well, one of the takeaways I had was I don't know if you consider yourself this, but as I'm kind of learning about you a little bit, I had Dr. Gary Habermas on a while ago, and he's one of the world's experts on the resurrection, and I talking to him, it already feels like talking to you is more the same in a very complimentary way, and what I mean is. He's I don't know whether he considers himself an apologist or you do. That term, putting labels on things sometimes gets silly, but I see you almost, as I was reading the book, I feel like you're almost a compassionate apologist, meaning you're making the case for what you believe in, but it's a very soft approach where there's no, I don't know, when I see these debates between atheists and the deists, I feel like the atheists are always more, they're just always more aggressive. They're always more violent. They're combative. And sometimes the deists on the other side, they ramp up their game and they end up kind of getting to that level too. But I enjoy, and I don't know, before I even go any further, is apologetics, would you put yourself in that category?
So I also don't like the term apologetics.
Okay,
I've been people have introduced me that way at events, and I don't think we have anything to apologize for. I really don't. I mean, right. I understand there's a more technical use of the term, but it starts believers off on the defensive. And I don't think, again, as I said in the beginning, I think it's perfectly rational. I'm perfectly happy to have a discussion with atheists. And I worked really hard on this book. And one of the reasons I specifically wasn't combative is among the people who read the book, I gave it to atheists. And so I for example, I use no insulting terms. Some atheists were insulted in earlier drafts that I used the term pagan. So I deleted the word pagan. You won't find the word pagan in the whole book. And I got a few of them to say at the end. I mean, I didn't encourage them to say this is what they would say. Something to the effect of, well, at least you gave me doubts about my doubts.
Oh, nice.
And that was as far as I was said, you know what? That's fine. And I have debated Michael Shermer. People can watch the debate if they want. It's on my website. It's on YouTube. It's on other places. And I have non-recorded debated other people who are atheists, or not debated. I've had moderated discussions. Let me put it that way. Yeah. They weren't sort of the classic debates. And there's no question. I think the atheists are generally angry, and I've actually thought a lot about that.
Yeah.
Why are atheists in these discussions so angry? You wouldn't believe some of the vitriol that occasionally comes up, both live and in emails and comments. I mean, it's amazing. And some atheists, I think there's a few different kind of atheists. I think some atheists are, interestingly enough, and I may be very sensitive to this because of my father's story, is I actually get the sense that they think there might be a God, and they're really, really angry at God because of all the evil in the world. And so they want to deny God the privilege, the right of existence.
Right.
And I've certainly seen that. I also think that there's something more, and this is actually what I challenged Michael Shermer on in the debate that I had with him, and he didn't really. I don't want to say take the bait, but he didn't really respond in this. One good thing about having a conversation, you and I do it too. Look, I'm going to be honest. You respond to those things you want to respond to, and you respond to other things. But I said, Dr. Shermer, I really think you do have a religion. I think, unfortunately, it's an idolatrous religion. It's a religion that ascribes superpower and super authority to science and to humans that really isn't appropriate. And let me back up for 1 second and just say how I define idolatry in the book. Idolatry is not what most people commonly think in this modern era, which is bowing down to statues or Wiccan chants or something like that.
Yeah.
Idolatry is something much more pernicious. It's a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing super authority or superpower to finite beings, people like us, ideologies, natural processes, and in the ancient world, animals, but not so much that anymore. And so we may have thought that we licked, idolatry and the God King Pharaoh 3,300 years ago. But in reality, at least we Jews think that we licked it with this. Sometimes think that was the whole Exodus and Passover story for Jews. Obviously, for Christians, that came about 1,200 years later with Jesus. But for my argument, actually, believe it or not, that's a quibble. Because I really want to get to what idolatry is, which is we think we don't have idolatry. Well, in reality, look at the 20th century, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, the Assad family, the Kim family, Hitler, and I could go on and on. They use the exact same tropes as Hitler: poetry, pageantry, parades, and theater, all, of course, backed up with networks of secret informers and strong secret police that would use violence. So how did Mao get away with causing the death of 75 million of his comrades? And between the March and the Great Leap Forward, and nobody complained. And he's ascribed to have said it would be okay if 300 million Chinese comrades would perish, if that would ensure the Chinese Communist Party would have power. And Hitler, and I'm going to set aside Hitler first. Let's take Stalin. He starved a quarter of the Ukraine. He killed all the kulaks. He sent tens of millions to the gulag, and nobody questioned his authority because Mao and Stalin and a whole host of others were God kings. The religion may have been the ideology, but that was so much more important, and those ideologies offered all truth. Well, the same thing goes for many alleged atheists. It's not that they're really atheists, that they don't believe in a God, but they believe in their own, or they believe in an adopted ideology, and frequently have their own God kings who they just believe whatever they say. And I think that there's certainly that with science. I mean, I think I've read a lot of books by scientists who are atheists who ascribe things to science that science could never actually say. And they just say, string theory works. Well, and we have a multiverse, and we have a this, and we have a that. Well, those are nice mathematical constructs, but they're certainly not proven hypotheses. They're not proven theories. And unfortunately, well, I don't want to say unfortunately, but in the go back and forth between Shermer and I and with others, people would say that science says stuff that it doesn't. It just doesn't. It can't. Not that it doesn't. It can't. At least at its current state. And so I find that a lot of atheists actually they have a ideology that they worship, they bow down to, and anything that contradicts that makes them angry.
Right. Hence the vitriol.
Hence the vitriol.
Yeah. No, I mean, because idolatry, actually, that was a good tie-in because you did talk about that a lot. And I think the distinction you make, because you do think your idolatry, whatever your background is, you immediately think of Old Testament-y type bowing to statues and golden, calves, and you just kind of have that image. But you're right, it is a more applicable today, in today's actual world. When you have folks like that become idols, they become false gods, really, right? And I've made this argument before to folks, and sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. I have to backtrack to keep my friends around, but right, when you look at the United States specifically and our Judeo-Christian principles, and there's no doubt in my mind, in my heart, that we've been so blessed as a nation. And whether you're secular or not, I think everyone can agree the United States is an amazing place to be. Right, we've had one of the greatest bouts of prosperity ever. I'm a firm believer that the principles that the country was founded on are absolutely inseparable from that. I don't think we got lucky there. I think that because we had that Judeo-Christian backing, I think that just set the stage for everything. And you're right; it kept that Maoist type, Stalin type regime mentality out of it. And I think that's a lot of us are scared that it could potentially go there someday if we keep chipping away at our basic principles. But no, I think that's I think idolatry, and I love the fact that you.
Can I? Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to wrap it up with I think the fact that you pulled out idolatry, and brought it more current and made it not such a an old timey word. I think that was cool. I enjoyed that, and to your point, it makes the book it's much more approachable.
So I wanted to riff off of, it's not really a riff, but when you started talking about the founding of the United States, and fundamentally how we are different, being a monotheistic, essentially a nation based on monotheism, so you have the God King Pharaohs, the Maos, the Stalins, the whoever, where their word is truth. But the founding fathers really were inspired, and there's Eric Nelson has written on this and others, but they were inspired by the concept of the Hebrew Republic. Now, if you look at the Hebrew Scriptures, which you would probably call the Old Testament, but the Scriptures that were written in Hebrew, basically.
The Torah, or even outside the
Torah? No, it includes everything up. It doesn't include the New Testament, so I'm including
the entire Old.
The entire Old Testament would be the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, and if you read them and you read how the monarchy is, particularly in Samuel and Kings, if you read and in Deuteronomy, Devarim as it is in Hebrew, then you come across something that's doesn't strike most people. But the Hebrew Republic, as it was supposed to be in King David's and Solomon's time, was a divided checks and balances form of government. You had the Torah, which were the 5 books of Moses, which was the legislated law that the king could not change. He had to actually have a Torah by him. It's clear in Deuteronomy that the king is required to always have a Torah, the law, right by him, and actually to write a Torah, to copy it down, to make the point even clearer that he didn't have the right to change the law. Then you had a separate power base of the high priest, who had his own, and the whole priestly cult had its own separate monetary base, the half a shekel, which didn't come from the king. King could make some, and did at times make contributions, but king didn't contribute to the temple. Then you had the Sanhedrin, which was the judicial branch, and they were. It was interestingly enough much of a meritocracy in those days, in that you had to be learned in the law to work your way up to from the small courts of 3 to the courts of 23 to the courts of 70 in the that met in the at the temple. So it was a meritocracy. So you had those 3 branches of government, if you will. Then you had the prophet, and Samuel is clear. The book of Samuel is clear. The book of Kings is pretty clear that the only way kingship really works is with the fourth estate. There weren't newspapers in those days, but there was prophecy. And then, interestingly enough, I think there was a people's veto as well. Because if you recall, when Solomon died and his son wanted to take over as king, he said there was Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and wanted to take over as king. He received a message from the prophet and from his own dream: don't try to resist the split of the kingdom. The people don't want you. Go back. Don't fight. You're rejected. And so ultimately, the people came together, heard out the program that Solomon's son had in mind, and rejected it. And God said, well, that's the people's right. Right. Very, very much.
You can see that corollary, right? Immediately to the United States.
But not only am I pointing it out, our founding fathers saw it. Even the ones, even though some of our founding fathers were probably deists, like Jefferson, they were really students of the Bible. Jefferson rewrote the Bible in his own sort of interesting way, but he certainly, I'm sure, understood. And in his Bible is a story of King Rehoboam, Solomon's son, who was rejected. And interestingly enough, this is probably one of the first times in the history of the world that you had a king, you had a leader, a president who left office essentially because the people voted him out.
Right.
And he left office in the top, for the 10 tribes. I don't think there's any example prior to the Bible of that.
Right. Yeah. No, interesting. So, yeah, for all you listening, then I was right when I was talking to you about when having my debates with my friends. So Scott agrees. No, that is a good, much more historical, backing to that. But I've always felt that to be the case, and you connected a lot more dots for me. So certainly appreciate that. Now, going back to the atheist thing.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
There is that. So part of having checks and balances, having a king, having a legislated law, a constitution, if you will, is that the Bible's making the point: no one has a monopoly on truth. And that's what really sets us aside. And that's what, frankly, to some degree worries me about today's world in the United States and elsewhere, is that more and more people do think they know what's right and that they have some sort of monopoly on truth. That's the scary part for me in modern society.
It is. I feel like every political debate is pretty much rooted in, at least a lot of the main issues are folks, I think, arguing based on the feeling and the notion, the thought, or whatever it might be, that they have that monopoly on the truth. And how can you not see it? And you're evil for not seeing it, and you're wrong. And I'm going to do whatever I can to convince you of my side. And then you get the ugliness that is the cesspool of the internet comments sometimes and all that stuff. So, but for sure. So going back to the atheist thing, because I think that's, some of the most interesting. I can't imagine, anyone not being fascinated with the atheist versus the deist concept, right? What bigger questions could we answer? Could we be asking except, is there a God and whatnot? So I've always been fascinated with just the perspective of atheists versus, a monotheistic viewpoint on the world. But you made a comment somewhere, because you'd hear atheists say, well, reason alone is enough, right? Why isn't reason alone sufficient in having in addressing the golden rule, right? Do unto others. If I'm a reasonable person, what and I know you have some good arguments for that. I'd love for you to just kind of articulate some of them because I've seen some of the interviews you've done on it. To answer that question, I'm a reasonable person. I love my family. I'm a good citizen. I don't like to hurt other people. Why do I have to have a God to be why do I need faith? Why isn't reason alone okay? I guess.
That's a fascinating question, and I have to say it's a question that I think bothers a lot of millennials and Gen Xers, particularly. I did a Google Book Talk. It was really a hoot, and so I met before and after. I got a nice tour. I got a little tour, and people knew what I was going there because it had been posted. Knew what I was coming to talk about. And I would say, at least 20 times, I was asked the question in different ways. Well, isn't reason enough? What do we need God for? I mean, this is a problem. So I think it bothers a lot of people, but I think for some reason it particularly bothers millennials, which is fine. And here's the reason I would give is that no, reason isn't enough. And reason isn't enough in the same way, to a certain degree, that it has a problem. It has a problem with idolatry. In that, if I take on the right to make final life, or someone takes on the right through their reasoning to make final life and death decisions, then ultimately the person who gets to be the person who decides sort of becomes deified. Let me explain what I mean. Let's take Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a moral philosopher who is clearly an atheistic moral philosopher. He has taken on the task, which I think is actually quite admirable, in that he takes atheism and then tries to figure out how that can be turned into a moral philosophy. I think that's useful. But here's where he goes off the deep end, is that ultimately he says on matters of life and death, there is a question about who qualifies. So he will say that if an infant is born and later it becomes clear that this infant, this baby boy or girl, has a serious defect, he thinks it's appropriate to commit infanticide. He's not so clear up to the age. Richard Dawkins doesn't like to talk about it very much, but he has responded in interviews that he agrees that, he says it gets very messy, but until a year or so, sort of why not? And essentially, I'm boiling him down, but this is what he says, is that at a certain level, people who have lost all capabilities lose their personhood. They no longer qualify for us to make, as a society, to make an expenditure in terms of sustaining their lives. So many people actually agree with that. I spoke to the head at some length, to the medical director of a major insurance company, who said, and this is prior to coronavirus, but it may still be even more true with coronavirus. I don't know. He said that 20% of our expenditures, at least, are as an American society on healthcare, are devoted to preserving the lives of folks who are over, I can't remember whether he had said 70 or 75. He said, if we just gave routine medical care to any person above 75 or below 30 days old, in other words, got rid of all of the neonatal care units, then we could save 20% of all expenditures, and we could probably afford to send most people to college for free. And as a society, that makes sense. And you know what? From a Peter Singer perspective, which is the way he would say it, it's quantifiable.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on principles. It just means that we're going to watch people die or make them die. And very quickly, I think any man-made morality does that. So I probably out of the 20 questions I got asked at Google about this, 10 of them reference Kant, about reason alone.
Yeah.
But nobody has taken the time, which is mind-boggling to me, to realize that Kant was a tremendous racist. He felt that Africans didn't even have feelings, that they were just a trifle. I think these are his words, something like a trifle above non-humans. He was incredibly sexist. He thought, men, and Voltaire sort of riffed off of him. He said, men are made to be superior and women to obey. I mean, he quickly, Kant, Voltaire, all of the folks that viewed reason as being enough quickly went off the deep end in terms of self-deification, and which is a form of idolatry, thinking the person you're looking at in the mirror is the God. And they all looked at themselves and said, other people who are different don't deserve the same protections as me. So very quickly, things can go off the deep end. Now, Peter Singer famously, this has been written about, his mother sadly was afflicted with Alzheimer's and some terrible diseases, and apparently he was going to put into place his philosophy. And his sister essentially said, no way, Jose. You may be a moral philosopher,
Right.
but still your mother's son.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as you were talking through that example, I'm thinking that philosophy could potentially be labeled as reasonable, right? Because if you could label it reasonable. However, what is it only reasonable until it affects someone very close to them, right? Like what, and then who's making that decision? Because at that point you are some idol, right? Some God has to make a decision. Like, okay, 76 years old, congestive heart failure, bye-bye, right? And then so it doesn't seem to scale as a practice, as a principle. It doesn't. But again,
it does scale. That's the problem that Hitler said it. I mean,
well,
it scaled.
Okay, fair.
He said everybody who's a mentally impaired. He started with the Germans. Any mentally impaired German was euthanized, essentially. And I mean, that's the problem.
Yeah, maybe it scales economically too well.
Scales.
Yeah, economically scales perfectly, unfortunately, right? Yeah, that's exactly the opposite problem. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so that obviously it's reason plus faith is the solution to that. Is that an accurate way to phrase it?
So, yes, a reason and faith, I mean, are absolutely go hand in hand. I mean, it's not that you should have, because blind faith is dangerous too, because that idolizes whoever the leader is. That turns people into God kings. Right. I mean, the third commandment, with the way we Jews count it, and I think Catholics too, but not all Protestants count the commandments. The third commandment is not to take God's name in vain, not in Hebrew, bashav, because it's the only commandment for which there is no redemption, if you read the commandments, which is sort of interesting, because anytime anyone sets themselves up as the sole spokesperson for God, we're in deep trouble, and because they can lead people, seriously astray. So you need to have whoever's doing the talking and telling you what to do. You need to apply your reason to that and say, is this person making sense? That's why there's so much discussion in the Bible of false prophets, because false prophets lead the people astray. Jeremiah said, stay in the land. The false prophets told the people what they wanted to hear. He said, to go to Egypt. They said to go to Egypt. So again and again, people are being asked in the Bible to use their noggins. God gave us all heads to use, not to just drink the Kool-Aid because Jim Jones says drink the Kool-Aid. Think about it. Does it really make sense? In the Jim Jones, they gave the Kool-Aid. The parents gave the Kool-Aid to the children first. They knew exactly what was happening, but they believed. And that's
Right.
That's how any kind of religion can become idolatry too, including, again, monotheistic religions, if we set up sole spokespeople.
Well, you mentioned our noggins, if you will. So free will was the next thing I know you touch on, and I kind of put evil sometimes and free will in the same sort of categories, right? Obviously, there's a big problem of evil that atheists obviously that bothers all of us, frankly, right? But so I always feel like evil is coupled with free will, meaning there's evil in the world because we have free will. What does the book talk about? What angles does the book take in that regard?
Well, look, I think the Bible does make it clear. The Bible does say we're ultimately responsible for our own decisions. And, Isaac Bashevis Singer famously said, we Jews have to believe in free will. We have no choice. And
right. I like that. Yeah,
that's sort of a very biblical notion in that the Bible understands that we're tethered to our environment, but that we can still think clearly. Early on, the Egyptian midwives, when they're told by Pharaoh, to kill the Israelite baby boys at the birth stool, but they can save the Israelite girls. Presumably, they're going to be turned into just female slaves for the Egyptians. They do something very interesting. These Egyptian midwives decide they're not going to do it because they understood this is a bad thing. But they couldn't say that to Pharaoh because they knew if they said that to Pharaoh, they would be killed. They would be executed right there. I mean, Pharaoh wouldn't give it. They wouldn't even furrow his brow. So what they said to him was something very interesting, and the Hebrew is so instructive here. They say that the Israelite women give birth like, where they don't need us. They give birth themselves. They give birth in the Hebrew. It says chiyut. They give birth like animals. And you know what? The funny thing is that Pharaoh believes him because he so believes his own lies. He actually doesn't even have, in a certain kind of way, his own free will before God even hardens his heart because he's so entangled in his own lies, whereas the Egyptian midwives are able to use their noggins and recognize that this is wrong. But by the way, I can't say it because if I say it explicitly, I'm going to get executed. Right. So I'm going to figure out how to play in to Pharaoh's. We're going to figure out, the two women figure out how they're going to play into lies. So this idea of free will is very subtle, but time and time again in the Bible, when people are faced with tough decisions, even though they're tethered to an environment that should have dictated a certain decision. So let's take Moses in the same story a little bit later. Moses is an Egyptian prince. He goes out and sees a Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. Now, what he should have done, being an Egyptian prince was probably like being a rock star with all the accoutrements and harems and privileges and whatever. Right. But he instead, he ends up killing. He beats he stops the Egyptian and then buries him to hide it, and then runs away. That's like a really, in a way, dumb decision based upon his life, because he could have had a great life living as a prince, getting some nice administrative job, and instead he throws it all away, ends up having to go to Midian for 40 years, never know he's coming back, walking around with sheep turd on his sandals as opposed to having, new clothes and new sandals every day. He had to leave, but he had to have free will to make that decision. And that's what the Bible says over and over again throughout the prophets, throughout the writings. And so, I think we can say people have their circumstances, but what makes them heroes of moral courage is overcoming those.
Right. So, but why, I guess, what is the purpose of evil? In other words, God knows what's going to happen before it happens. We all have free will. He knows that there's going to be quite a bit of atrocities committed to, the people he made in his image. And so what is the take? So right now, coronavirus, the pandemic is changing the world as we know it. There's so many people suffering, so many people dying. So many people just flat out scared. So many people are going to be bankrupt.
Yes.
So
all the above.
So the folks that are listening to this, I know we have a little time left here. And this is a good tie-in for to the evil concept or to suffering. What is what's God's plan here? What is why are we suffering right now, specifically now, but in general, I guess.
Well, look, there are two kinds of suffering. There's suffering that comes from human-made decisions. I mean, and I think God steps back and lets that play out depending on how we react. So, when Hitler took power, there were plenty of people who knew what was going on. People who knew the concentration camps were taking place, knew about the death camps, knew about Auschwitz, who didn't do anything. Who let it play out. And I have this strong belief that when we do the right thing, God gives us a tailwind. So, I mean, that's what the whole story of the book of Esther is about. The name of God isn't even mentioned in the whole book. But when Esther acted with moral courage, a whole bunch of, which was in a very complicated way, she set about a whole plot which ended up saving the Jews who were about to be massacred throughout the Persian Empire. And God gave her a wind to her back. And we see that over and over again. If people do the right thing, they get a wind to their back. They get the coincidences frequently end up going, in my view, in the right direction. On the other hand, when we don't do anything, when we stiffen our own hearts, then God just looks back and doesn't necessarily help us. That's what happened in World War II with the Jews. There were plenty of famously the Canadian Prime Minister, when asked to take in Jews, said no Jews is too many. And Roosevelt refused to bomb the concentration camps, which would have at least disrupted the killing. Even though it might have killed people killed inmates, it would have disrupted the killing. People made decisions. My father's neighbors looked on and assisted as all the Jews were murdered. But when we do the right thing, it goes in the other direction. And I think the challenge for us, and the Bible says over and over again, that pestilence, which is what we're facing, and all sorts of other things that arise are actually tests for us. Will we meet the challenge or won't we meet the challenge? So for us today, that's the question. Will we meet this challenge? Will we be compassionate? Will people take advantage economically?
Right.
Will people say that they are facing hardship when they're not facing hardship? If they're still receiving their paycheck, will they still apply for all sorts of aid? Take it from people who need that aid desperately. Will companies try to maintain their employees? And it goes on and on and on. And that's the question of what we do as human beings in terms of both the physical toll and perhaps even the death toll of what decisions we make will probably dwarf that of the actual death toll from the virus itself. So it's always about a test for us human beings. And that's the majesty of what the Bible is trying to convince us of, and why so many people actually like tuning it out.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I know we have a few minutes here and we'll wrap up in a second, but you did have a great quote that I think you said, and I want to quote it here. I want to read it here. It said, I don't know if I heard this on an interview you had said, I think you said something like, the less people read or study the Bible, the less they like it. And I just circled that. I said, I love that. I love that.
That's me. I've said that.
No, I love it. I really do. So, we're kind of running out of time. How can people get in touch with you? Where are you at? I know you have your own website, scottshay.com, is it?
scottshay.com, SHAY. A lot of people actually, I just spoke to the publisher's the representative. A lot of people are actually listening to my book now. I've been told.
Oh yeah, I'm an Audible guy myself.
It's an Audible. Okay. Yeah, he said the Audible's doing real well right now. So I have the book it's in physical form. It's in you can if you go to scottshay.com, you can get links to Amazon or independent bookstores, but most of those are closed today. So you can get the book on Amazon. You can get a Kindle. You can get it Audible. There are study guides. There are a number of churches around the country that are using the book as a discussion group. It's a 6-week discussion group, which follows the 6 sections of the book. I do webinars from time to time. I'm reachable on my website. I look at all the emails. The only thing I would say to your listeners is sometimes I try to respond to emails. And I do respond to the overwhelming majority, but I sometimes get book length questions, mostly or chapter length questions. Those I can't respond to because I raise a lot, but people can listen to the debate with Michael Shermer, to the Google Book Talk, to a whole host of other interviews. And again, they can reach me. The paperback is due to come out in June as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. I know you have a hard stop, so I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate your time and the conversation.
Vinny, this has really been a great conversation. Many blessings to you.
You as well. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that's a wrap. We'll see you next time. Be safe out there.